In 1958, James Mellart, an English archaeologist, arrived at an ancient site near a Turkish town in which he found small shards of volcanic glass called obsidian that had been polished and perfected by the inhabitants of the Stone Age settlement called Catalhoyuk. Now dated to around 6000 BCE, these shards are seen as the earliest manufactured mirrors in human history. And since that time, purpose-made mirrors have been mined in parts of China, Mesopotamia, Greece, Mesoamerica, and Egypt. And though they are instruments of profoundly practical use, mirrors seem to have produced in every age and place. They have proved to be vital. A sense of visceral mystery, primal fear, and supernatural power. In many ways, more than simply being tools for self-grooming, they became the province of shamans and soothsayers. They became the apparatus for prediction, prophecy, and prognostication, a device for clairvoyance, telepathy, and divination. They provided people calling themselves scryers with supposed premonitions and a profitable vocation. And the association of mirrors with mystery wove its way into ancient myth, fairy tales, and modern fiction too. Snow White's stepmother consults a magic mirror on the wall that tells the truth but triggers her fall. Alice in Wonderland walks through the looking glass which opens her eyes but casts her into a world of fright not too unlike the path on which Thomas Anderson embarks in The Matrix. But it all starts with the myth of Narcissus, whose very name, tied to the Greek narke, implies the reaction he has upon first seeing his reflection. Like an optical narcotic, the sight of his own face mesmerized and immobilized him, leading the strapping young man, Narcissus, to ignore everything else and wither away in an all-consuming self-obsession. Many of the mirrors that have been unearthed from ancient Greece are adorned with the image of the god Pan, a deity of wildness and unpredictability from whom we derive the term panic. And this visceral fear of the influence that resides in the madness and the mystery of the mirror manifests beyond myth and folklore and fiction in halakha, where the Shulchan Aruch simply states, Asur le'ish lehistakel b'mar'eh, a man is prohibited from looking in a mirror. Now, practically speaking, there are all sorts of exceptions to this prohibition, but at its most rudimentary, this regulation reflects a deep wariness of the object that can ensnare the ego and plague the self with a devastating narcosis. Which leads us to a remarkable fact that we read this morning on the subject of the Mishkan. Because we've already been told that the ark would be made from wood and gold, that the altar would be made from wood and brass, that the tabernacle's coverings would be woven from twisted linen, and that the lava, the kior, the basin from which priests would draw water to wash their hands and feet, would be made from copper. But not until this morning were we told the source from which this copper would come. V'yaset hakiyor nechoshet, the basin would be made from copper. Ve'et kano nechoshet, and its base would be made from copper, bamarot, with mirrors. And this is my question. Why are our priests greeted by and cleansed with, at the very threshold of our most sacred space, a vessel forged from objects steeped in the hazards of vanity? Why, when even then ancient peoples understood the perils of reflection, that the mystical allure of mirrors carries a narcotic power, does our tabernacle glisten with their sheen? And we are not alone in our confusion, for rabbinic tradition records a Mosaic objection to the use of mirrors in our temple's assembly. But in the Midrashic imagination, Moshe was overruled by divine fiat, as heaven contended that mirrors had a vital role at the entrance of the temple. In the words that the sages ascribed to God, Elu chavivin alai min hakol, these contributions are more dear to me than anything else. So for the sages, it seems that these mirrors were not simply permitted or legitimate or admissible, but mandated by God over the objections of Moshe himself. Why? What is so important about the mirrors that warrants their mention and outweighs the threats posed by their reflective complexion? And there are two answers I'd like to share with you this morning, beginning with a 15th century manuscript first published in London in 1959. And in this document, the Moshav Zikanim, comprised of the collective observations of the European Tosophists, the cost of the mirror's symbolic association with sacred space is dwarfed by a single, seemingly pragmatic benefit. The basin, or the kior, sat in a very specific place on temple grounds between the public courtyard and the sanctuary building itself, poised perfectly to reflect an image of the ritual activity within to those without access who were assembled without. In the words of the Tosophists, Yisrael shahayu ba'azara, the Jews who were out in the courtyard, ro'in kol avodat kohen, could see all the priestly service being performed al yedei hamarot, through these mirrors, uki'ilu haya lifnim, and it was as if they were inside the sanctuary themselves. For these Tosophists, the key reason that mirrors are employed in the sanctuary is not for personal reflection, but ritual transparency. The basin serves as the tabernacle's equivalent to C-SPAN, and the fact that priests confront their own faces on the way in is an unfortunate consequence of providing a measure of visual access to the people. In fact, for the Tosophists, it is perhaps best that the Kohanim close their eyes or train them away from the basin itself as they wash their hands and feet, evading the lures of reflection. The mirrored surface is a spiritual risk for those who serve within the temple, but it is a means of connection for those who don't. But the other view that I'd like to share with you is found not in the notes of a band of medieval master commentators, but in the notes of a first-generation student of the Baal Shem Tov and the author of the first published Hasidic work, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polinia, a town in western Ukraine. And for him, the kior's material had nothing to do with transparency. It was precisely for the purpose of the priests seeing themselves that mirrors were used for the basin. And though seeing the sight of one's own face can risk a bout of narcissism, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef suggests that in this context, in the temple context, it would engender a deeper self-reflection. He notes that Kohanim, like priests in other parts of the ancient world, were primarily agents of other people's purgation, aiding those suffering under the weight of sin. They spent their time offering sacrifices on behalf of negligent and accidental offenders. They trained to treat patients afflicted with spiritual diseases. But every day, before entering the temple and punching into work, they would stand and face the basin and clean their hands and feet. And when they bathed their toes and washed their wrists, thinking of all the criminals and sinners they were charged to assist, they would glimpse an image of themselves. And there was no risk here, because in the words of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, as they held in their minds the thought of all the people whose lives they would heal, Yistaklu b'mar'eh, they would look in a mirror. V'yirut peneihem, see their own faces. V'yad'u shemit kavanin gam lehem, and understand that they had to heal themselves as well. While the clerics of ancient cults were so often seen as an elite force of ministers forgiving others' sins but relieved of the need to repent their own, the Kohanim had to look every single day in the mirror to remind themselves that they too are riddled with imperfection, that they too must undergo self-correction, that they too, despite their divine selection, needed to labor to maintain their connection with God. It is true that mirrors in a vacuum pose a risk to our sanity and humility, but in the context of serving and perfecting humanity, they can remind the reflective viewer that they need perfecting too. We are, as Jews, the chosen people. We are collectively a mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of priests, and for that belief we have been impugned by others as conceited, accused of grandiosity. We have been scorned and scolded and censured as prejudiced, as pompous, and as imperious. But our creed never intended to suggest that we are vested with a natural preeminence. There is a vast difference between those who have seen themselves as a master race and we who see ourselves as a chosen people. Rabbi Sachs perhaps put it best when he said, a chosen people is the very opposite of a master race. A master race worships itself, a chosen people worships something beyond itself. A master race values power, a chosen people cares for the powerless. A master race believes it has rights, a chosen people knows only responsibilities. The key virtues of a master race are pride, honor, and fame. The key virtue of a chosen people is humility. A master race produces monumental buildings, triumphal inscriptions, and a literature of self-congratulation. Israel, to a degree unique in history, produced a literature of almost uninterrupted self-criticism. Mirrors on their own, it is true, can lead to the worship of the self. A reflection unchecked can trigger an all-consuming narcosis. But in the context of service, in the context of the temple, in the context of sacred space, self-reflection is a means to achieving humility and transforming that spirit into the energy to heal others with integrity and empathy and care. So as we all reflect on our lives and reflect on our place in these trying times, may we all emerge inspired to lead the effort to heal the world as a nation of priests to all those in need. I wish you all a Shavua Tov, a week filled with peace.